Well, it is our honor and privilege to have with us today Dr. Brian Strayer, Professor Emeritus here at Andrews University in the History Department. And he's joining us today to talk about a book that has changed the history of history, that is, of the Adventist Church. That is Richard W. Schwartz's Light Bearers to the Remnant. And so we're honored to have Dr. Strayer with us to talk about this book because he was playing a key role in the construction of this book back in the 1970s. Thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Good. So we wanted to ask, first of all, why was Dr. Richard Schwartz asked to write Light Bearers to the Remnant? Who is commissioning this work? What entity or individuals are involved in that? And then what is significant, and why was it significant that a trained historian in this era of history and in this region of history was asked to write this book?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to remember that Light Bearers to the Remnant was commissioned by the Education Department of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. It was commissioned to be a textbook at the college level, primarily junior, senior college level, throughout our North American division colleges and any other colleges around the world that wanted to use it. So as a textbook, it required a well-informed, published scholar in the field of history to be able to do it. Now, Richard Schwartz, in 1965, had written a dissertation on John Harvey Kellogg, American Health Reformer at the University of Michigan. So he had made a name for himself already in the 1960s as a Seventh-day Adventist historian and scholar of merit. Of course, his book was later published as John Harvey Kellogg, M.D., and that book came out about 5 years later, as I recall, 1970. Interestingly, he wrote me a little note here. To one who was my good right hand in another research project. And that, of course, was Light Bearers to the Remnant that we're talking about today. So he had a PhD in history. Here at Andrews University, Schwartz taught American history, he taught Russian history courses, he taught African American history courses, he taught research methods, he taught great historians in the graduate level program. So he was an eminent historian with a worldwide reputation. And the General Conference Education Department wanted someone with a broader background, not just church history, but also American history and other international areas of history.
And this is the first time a trained historian in this area has actually written a history of the Adventist Church.
That is correct. When you think back over the years, I mean, Loughborough wasn't trained, Emmy Olson wasn't, even C. Mervyn Maxwell, his training was specifically in church history. It wasn't the broader, American history or international history. So this is the first time.
Yeah, and Maxwell was trained in the early years, especially of Christian history.
Yes,
and his book, Tell It to the World, wasn't comprehensive and so forth.
That's true.
Kind of tapers off after 1901. So
1901 is where that ends.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, great. So tell me about what you think this book is doing. I mean, we know that the author, Dr. Schwartz, has got the training and ability, but what is this book attempting to do that other histories of Adventism have not done yet?
I think Schwartz's major contribution in this book is detail. Each chapter is loaded with names, dates, places. It is a textbook, and so it does deal with the who, what, where, when, how, and why. On a deeper level, the how and whys are the analysis. And Schwartz does more analysis than any previous historian has ever done. He doesn't only say who did what, when, and where, but why did they do it? What impact did their actions have? What was the result of that meeting or that encounter or that published work? So he deals in the levels of the hows and whys, the significance of Adventist history.
And that hasn't really been done before.
No, not really.
Yep.
No.
Well, fantastic. So was it intentionally crafted to be more inclusive? would you say? Are women and non-white men, are they getting more treatment in this book? Was it intentionally crafted to be non-American centric too? And if it was, and if it wasn't, but how well is it achieving these kinds of goals?
The textbook was specifically crafted to be inclusive. At the time, there were those in our minority Adventist groups, and particularly the regional conferences, the leadership of the regional conferences, who had confidence in Swartz based upon his background in teaching African American history. They just plain out bluntly said that if Tell It to the World, which was being written at the same time, was chosen by the General Conference as a textbook, they would not use it in their colleges. They would not use it.
Yeah.
They had confidence that Dr. Swartz would tell the whole story. And while Dr. Swartz was not multilingual, I mean, he knew French and he knew German, he knew English. He was able to read many of the primary sources that included other areas of the world, specifically Europe and Asia and so forth, that made this a more comprehensive global Adventist history, which Maxwell and others, Loughborough and so forth, they were not including the rest of the world. It was primarily North America that they included. Yeah.
Do you feel like it was well received in that regard?
Yes, I do. At the time, this came out in 1979, so it was adopted by most of our Adventist colleges in North America during the 1980s and 1990s. I myself taught out of this at Andrews. Swartz taught out of it. Gary Land taught out of it. I taught from it right down to the 21st century. When I retired, I was still using the updated light bearers that Floyd Greenleaf had updated. So yes, I think it was very well received.
Okay. Well, tell us about the like how the book was put together. So you're working with Swartz, but what is Schwartz's role? I mean, clearly he's listed as the author,
right?
But what is his role in this project, and what is your role in this project, and so forth? And I can ask some specifics about that. Like, is he specifically going out and seeking and hunting down sources, or are you the archival hound that he's using to go chase this down? And so forth. And then I want to ask some more specific questions for you about your role too, but let's start there.
Well, let me just give a brief note here. The fact that his name is on the book, by R.W. Swartz, was a battle and a fight.
Really?
That was a fight. The General Conference did not want his name on the book. They simply wanted it to be a denominational history textbook for Seventh-day Adventist college classes prepared by the Department of Education, General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. The Association of Seventh-day Adventist Historians went to bat for Swartz. They said, look, yes, this is a textbook, but it's also an interpretation of history. And the person who wrote it deserves to have his name on the textbook. And so because of the pressure applied by Adventist historians around the world, Swartz got his name on the textbook. But it was a battle.
Interesting. Can you unpack that battle more? You've piqued my interest. This is new to me, so you didn't tell me that before. So tell me more about that battle, if you can.
The General Conference brethren are always sensitive as to how an author will be perceived, as well as how an author may live out the rest of his life. There was an author of a denominational textbook called Facing Life that actually took his own life, committed suicide. I think you and I know who that was. And they were, I think, still sensitive with regards to that issue. What if Swartz were to apostatize? What if he were to have a major disagreement with some church leaders, like Andreasen did, for example? What if things were to turn unpleasant after the textbook was written? They felt like it would be better not to have a name on the textbook. But like I said, ASDA, the Association of Seventh-day Adventist Historians, went to bat for him, said, no, this is interpretation. Future generations need to know who actually did this writing, who interpreted history. And I'm happy to say that Swartz remained orthodox and in good regular standing to the day of his death, so that there's no shame or embarrassment in having his name on the book. Consequently, when it was updated by Greenleaf, there was no contest. Greenleaf's name was going to be added after Richard Swartz to the update. Now, as far as Swartz's role and my role, basically he was the writer. What I did was I checked in every morning at 8 o'clock and waited for him to come. And when he arrived, we went into his office together and we would go over what we were going to do that day. He would give me a list of sources that he wanted me to examine and take notes on. So I would come over here to the James White Library. If the books were able to be checked out of the main stacks, I checked them out in my name. If not, then they were in the Adventist Heritage Room, as it was then called. Mrs. Louise Dedrin was in charge. And that's an interesting side story, too, because Dr. Swartz came over and introduced me to her and said, now, Brian is going to need to take sources from the Heritage Room every day, Monday through Friday. Well, you could see, my books, my sources, leaving my control. Louise Dedrin was a sweetheart, but she was Belgian, Belgian French, and very protective. And so Swartz and her, they worked out an agreement. I would get the sources at 8 in the morning, take them over to Swartz's outer office, type up the notes, and then I had to have the sources back by 5, the same day, okay? So if I wasn't finished, I had to mark where I left off, with a bookmark, and then I could pick it up the next day. But I was faithful the whole year long in getting those sources back. So she and I became good friends. She knew she could trust me. But during the day, I was sitting there at a small table desk, just big enough for the IBM Selectric typewriter. That was the latest technology we had. And beside me was a book stand. So I would have the book on the stand, open, and then I would begin taking notes. And these are the actual notes. I haven't seen these in half a century. These are my typed notes, all right, 4 by 6 inch. And I would always put in parentheses the page where I found the information, all right, the author at the top and the title, the publisher, and the date. And then later was added the library card catalog number. So I would type these out and then staple them, as you can see, staple them together and then hand them to him, to Dr. Swartz. And he would actually write from my notes. Now, he didn't know how to type. It certainly would have saved us time if he had, but he took 8.5 by 11 sheets of typing paper and a whole bevy of pencils lying on the corner of his desk. He'd pick up a pencil and write with it, hand write with it, until it was dull. Then he'd pick up another pencil, hand write with it. And when he finished that particular manuscript, that portion of the chapter, he would hand it to Veronica Birkenstock. And I have her picture here in the yearbook. By the way, this is the 1975 Cardinal of Andrews University. This is Dr. Swartz as he looked then. This is me, very much like Dick Van Dyke, short hair, dark glasses. And over here is Veronica Birkenstock. She was a teacher at Helderberg College in South Africa. And her specialty was what they then called secretarial science. Okay, so she was an excellent typist. So he would hand that manuscript to her. She would type it up, hand it back to him. He would make corrections and polish, and then hand it back to her. She would type a second draft, then she would hand it to me. And then I would go through and make suggestions. From time to time, I had to remind Dr. Swartz, this is a college-level textbook. This isn't being written primarily for Adventist scholars and historians. Dr. Swartz had a style that I would call complex compound. He liked long sentences, particularly sentences that contained what we call subordinate subjective clauses, many of which began with the word which, okay? So this particular event, which happened after that event, blah, blah, blah. So I would go through, I would change those long, complex sentences I would introduce verbals, participles, gerunds, infinitives to add more punch, shorten the verbiage, more punch. As a consequence, he gave me a nickname. He called me his witch hunter. It was done affectionately. He approved of my changes, and then he would hand the manuscript back to Veronica with his okays or don't change this and so forth. She would type it a third time, and then it would go to the General Conference Education Department, and they would send it out to the readers. And believe it or not, there were about 100 critical readers. Imagine trying to satisfy 100 people around the world. And then they would send in their comments, and then we would make changes to, please the guy in New Guinea who felt we hadn't said enough about New Guinea and so forth. And then it would go in the file, and we start the next chapter. So I was the one who went and sought out the sources, and I was the one that took the notes on the sources, but Schwartz knew ahead of time because the reading committee had designated what sources fit which chapters. So he knew ahead of time what sources he needed to have me seek out. And then if he needed to look at them again, I knew where they were. We had the library card catalog number. In those days, you had to go to what we call the card catalog, and it was all paper. You slid out a tray, and you flipped through with your fingers till you found the title you wanted, and then you copied down, right? The BX 6155.4-076, and went and pulled it off the shelf. No computers, no PCs, no laptops, no Blackberries, no cell phones. I mean, it was all, handwritten and typewritten is what we did.
That's fascinating. I'm loving getting the history of this book here. So, but I want to know more. Like, do you feel like you made any other significant contributions to the book, like in areas of like maybe finding crucial sources that Schwartz didn't, clue you into, or maybe some key points of analysis? Did you play even that kind of a role in the book?
Well, I'd like to mention the name of Hetty Jemison. I mentioned that we worked with Louise Dedrin at the Adventist Heritage Room, but at that time in the 1970s, the E.G. White collection was separate. They had not yet been combined, so it was over in the seminary, down in the basement in the seminary, and Hetty Jemison was in charge. So I would go over there and I'd say, Dr. Schwartz would like to look at such and such a document. She says, oh, well, if he's interested in that topic, there's this and that and the other that he might want to see too. I mean, she was superb. May she rest in peace. She was superb. Just telling us sources that we may not have had on our list, but they were directly related to a topic that he was writing on. So I was grateful. Dr. Schwartz was grateful for her additional help. And she had no problem if we wanted to keep them overnight. Bless her heart. She had no problem with that. She was a little more laid back. She was an American, of course, and she was laid back about that. As far as my contribution, I think my primary contribution to the book at its time was style, helping to smooth Schwartz's style. But during my spare time, what little I had, when we weren't particularly doing research notes, he did ask me to skim read through the doctrinal articles in the old Advent Review and Sabbath Heralds and determine what doctrines got how much attention year by year. So these have never been seen before, okay? So I'm showing them for the first time, all right? These are the original charts that I drew up of the doctrines in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. See, I've got 2,300 days, I've got tours, 3 angels' messages, providence, Sabbath, sanctuary, so forth. And then on the back of the sheets, I did my own statistical analysis as to what percent of the doctrinal articles were contained in that review on each subject. So he asked me to do this. I think it only ended up being about a paragraph in one chapter, but it was days, weeks, months of work during that first year, 1974-75, of drawing up these charts that I created myself. And I got as far as, I think it was 1878 or so was the last one. Yeah, 1878. So I did 1850 to 1878, skimming all those reviews, and you know how small that print is. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, my eyes were better then. I was only 23. And drawing up these charts, which Schwartz looked at. Like I say, it may have amounted to only about one paragraph in a doctrinal chapter, but at least I made that contribution. In addition, I was looking for a friend of mine. I was looking for early developments in Adventism in New York and Pennsylvania. I'm a New Yorker by birth, and this gal was from Pennsylvania, and she said, if you find any little tidbits, any stories about Pennsylvania or southern New York, let me know. So I would take side notes on that. That's how I discovered the tragic story of Nathan Fuller, because he came from Wellsville, and Ulysses, Pennsylvania was his birthplace, and the wonderful story of Sarah A. Halleck Lindsay, which developed out of his demise, the tragic story of his fall and apostasy. So that became a later contribution. I wrote articles on both of them for the now defunct Adventist Heritage Journal. And so I was quite excited, when the recent picture of Sarah Lindsay was discovered in the George I. Butler collection.
Yes.
We didn't have her picture, 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. So those became eventual contributions of mine. Now, even after that year was up, 74, 75, Schwartz didn't completely let me go. I went into church school teaching in Jackson, but he continued to send me the chapters to edit, even though I wasn't doing the research, because he liked how I polished his style. His witch hunter.
He liked his witch hunter. That's right.
To have a steady hand on the manuscript as it developed.
I'm starting to realize with you, we need to start adding up all the different names that you've been given. Witch hunter, Strayer the Slayer. I mean, come on.
Yeah, many nicknames over the years.
Yeah, you've got quite a few here. So, oh, that's fantastic. So, going back to Fuller and Lindsay, did Schwartz? I'm not remembering. Did he include anything about Nathan Fuller?
I believe there's a mention of Sarah Lindsay in his chapter that deals with women here.
I thought there was. But,
a brief mention. I don't believe Nathan Fuller appears in this particular book, but I did tell him that I thought that Sarah Lindsay was significant enough that she deserved some mention. At that time, we weren't 100% sure when she had been licentiate, given a ministerial license, and we weren't 100% sure whether she was the first one or was there someone else.
Right.
Now we know she was the first.
Right.
But her name is mentioned in there, and then of course I amplified her story in the Adventist Heritage magazine, and later in the article I wrote for the online STA Encyclopedia.
Yeah, those are definitely very strong contributions, and so for what it's worth, thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
I've read and appreciated both of those articles. So.
It was kind of a serendipitous development, and I'm always grateful that her name was Kathy Child. She was both an academy friend of mine and a college friend of mine down at Southern. And she was the one that asked me to, if you find anything, just let me know. I'm interested in our local history. Yeah. So thanks to Kathy Childs, we discovered the first woman who was licensed as a minister, and we discovered the story behind those 50 pages in Testimonies Volume 2 that actually does mention Brother Nathan Fuller. Names don't get mentioned often in the testimonies, but his is.
His is,
and
that's right.
There's 50 pages on him in Testimonies Volume 2. So.
Well, the Fuller controversy is long gone, but
Yes.
were there any controversies surrounding Light Bearers to the Remnant when it comes out? Let's move forward a few years and talk about that.
Well, when you're trying to satisfy a reading committee of 100, it's the impossible dream. It's the impossible dream. Brother A over here in Papua New Guinea is going to say, you didn't say enough about New Guinea. And, Brother C over in Hong Kong is going to say, you need to say more about this and that. And So, it was a tug of war to try to please that many people. I think Dr. Schwartz did the best he could. I think the arbiter was the General Conference Education Department. I mean, they decided, whether we had to or didn't have to satisfy all the demands from out in the field. But that was a challenge. I'm glad to say when Greenleaf did the update, he only had 3 or 4 readers that he had to please, But we had 100, and so some of them weren't too happy with us. That's true.
Well, beyond that, let's get specific. So,
Okay.
was Dr. C. Mervyn Maxwell on that group of 100 people?
He was. I suppose today we might consider that to be a conflict of interest, because here he was at the same time that we were working on Light Bearers, he was working on his book, Tell It to the World. His book was published in 76. Light Bearers came out in 79. So he was wrapping up his book. I presume it probably went to press, 74, 75, and he was on the reading committee. Kind of hard to ignore the chair of the church history department. He's knowledgeable about Adventist history for sure. So he was on the reading committee. He got each of the chapters, and he sent us very detailed responses to each of the chapters. But he was one of the ones that wasn't always happy with what we had to say.
Do you want to unpack that a little bit more? I want to prod you a bit here.
You are prodding.
You've shared a bit more here.
Yes, well, this is a story that's never been told. I'm safely retired now, so I think I can tell the story. It's not a happy one, but it is one that taught me a lesson that I needed to learn. I was 23. C. Mervyn Maxwell was hoping that his Tell It to the World would become the college-level textbook for the North American Division. For a number of reasons that I've gone into in a previous lecture, it was not chosen. It was inadequate on many, many levels. But he didn't know that the General Conference wasn't going to choose his book until a certain faculty meeting in the seminary occurred, and one of the seminary professors mentioned that Dr. Schwartz had been chosen to be the author of the Light Bearers to the Remnant, and that was going to be the denominational textbook. Those who were closest to Dr. Maxwell physically at the time, more proximate to where he was sitting, said his face changed dramatically. He was shocked, he was disappointed, he was hurt, and he was just sure, that his book was going to be the denominational textbook. So any response that he gave to Dr. Schwartz seemed to come out of a sense of professional jealousy. You got, the textbook commission, and I didn't. And I resent that, was kind of the underlying feeling that we got. So one of the letters that he sent with critiques of the early chapter manuscripts, he did not send it to Dick Schwartz at his office in the history department. Professionally speaking, that's what he should have done. He put a stamp on it, and he sent that envelope to the Schwartz home. The Schwartzes lived on Maplewood Drive here in Berrien Springs at the time. Well, that meant that Dr. Schwartz's wife, Joyce, who taught art at the Village Adventist School, got to the mail first, because Schwartz and our day didn't end until 5 o'clock. So she got the afternoon mail, and she opened it. And when she read Maxwell's letter, which was full of bitterness and negative criticism, she cried. She cried. So when Dr. Schwartz got home that night, here's his wife distraught. He read the letter. It upset him. The next day, he came to work, and he said, Brian, he says, I'm not going to write today. I'm going to go work in my garden today. They had a big garden over there by the racetrack on campus. He said, I want you to take this letter and I want you to spend the day in the library. I want you to hunt down every point that Dr. Maxwell makes and let me know which points is he correct on, which points isn't he correct on, okay? And then write me up a report for tomorrow. So he went and worked in his garden. That, I'm sure, was good therapy for him. Like Voltaire says in the book Candide, we should all work in our own gardens. Well, he did. And I went to the library, and with every point I examined, my blood pressure was just rising. And I discovered at the end of the day that in half of the cases, Maxwell had a point. Sometimes it was a very minor point, but he was correct. In the other half of the cases, he was either so vague or indirect that I couldn't tell whether he was correct or not. He didn't give enough specifics so that I could hunt down, a source that backed him up or not. So at the end of the day, I wrote up a report, and I placed it on Dr. Schwartz's desk, and I went home, and on my own manual typewriter, I typed up a letter. And that was a letter that I intended to send to Dr. Maxwell. And the lesson I learned out of writing that letter was you should let a day or two go by before you write such letters. It was very much in the spirit of Maxwell's own letter to Dr. Schwartz. I was telling him off and letting him know that half of what he said couldn't be proved one way or the other. Much of the rest that could be proved wasn't all that significant, and so forth. So I made a copy of the letter. I sent the original, put it in an intercampus mail envelope, put it in the mail to go out the next day.
Who'd you address it to?
I addressed it to Dr. Cyril M. Maxwell. Now that was twisting the knife in the wound because Dr. Maxwell went by his middle name, all right, Mervyn. He did not like his first name, and I knew it. So here I am in my 20s twisting the knife in the wound by addressing it to Dr. Cyril M. Maxwell. And so then I put a copy on Dr. Schwartz's desk. He came in the next morning, he read my report, and then he read my letter. And then he called me in for a consultation. And he said, please shut the door. So I did. He said, Brian, I appreciate very much your loyalty. You've demonstrated that you are loyal to me and that you care about my feelings and that you feel that Maxwell's letter was unjustified. He said, be that as it may, however, he's a very powerful man and he can hurt your future career if he reads this letter and then reacts. He said, you're just getting started. I had 7 academies asking me to come and teach history. I turned them all down to do this job for Schwartz. So I was just getting started in the educational work. He said, I really would appreciate it, Brian, if you would go and retrieve that letter. I said, well, it's already gone out in the intercampus mail. He said, well, would you go take a walk down to the post office and get that letter? So I went to the post office, and they told me, well, the letter's already gone out, all right? The delivery person has already taken the mail out. So I went back to Dr. Schwartz. I said, I'm sorry, sir, but it's too late. It's already gone out. He said, well, if it's already gone out, it may be in Maxwell's box. He may not have seen it yet. Would you go over there to Maxwell's office and retrieve that letter? So I did. I went over and I talked to his secretary, and I think I made up what we call a white lie. I said, Dr. Schwartz would like that letter back. There's some things he wants to add to it. So she handed it to me. And as she did, she said, oh, and by the way, Dr. Maxwell goes by C. Mervyn Maxwell, not Cyril. He doesn't use his first name. I said, oh, okay, thank you. Well, I knew that already. So I took it back to Schwartz, and we went into another little confab there. And so he said, okay, thank you. So I have this copy that you made for me. I have this copy that you made for Maxwell. Are there any other copies in existence, Brian? I said, no, I didn't make one for myself. He said, good. All right. Thank you very much. And that was basically the end of that. Dr. Maxwell did not actually find out about that until decades later. When he and I became friends, as fellow colleagues. I was teaching here in the 80s and 90s, and he and I were both on the Center for Adventist Research committee. And when I got to know him, I mentioned this incident to him. And you know, he looked me in the eyes, he said, "Brian, I don't remember anything at all about that." The thing that had hurt me the deepest, he had no memory of that at all. So I said, "Oh, okay, well, that hurt Mrs. Swartz, it hurt Dr. Swartz, it hurt me. It was pretty big when it happened." And when I went to his viewing, to the funeral parlor, his wife, Pauline Maxwell, mentioned to me, she said, "You know, I'm so glad that you and my husband were reconciled before the end came." I said, "I am too, Pauline." I said, "I carried that bitterness for many, many years, and I'm glad that we could get it out in the open and, be reconciled." But, it is interesting. Our memories can play tricks on us. What I remembered so well, he had no memory of at all. So, anyway, I hope that doesn't get you into trouble. I'm retired, but...
Well, if we have to, we'll just let this video sit for a bit
until
I retire. No, you're the one talking. I'm
Yes,
just listening,
yes.
so I feel like I'm okay here. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's fascinating. I mean, I'm very sorry that it caused trouble and hurt to people in the past, but I think people from my generation and era would look at this and say, "Well, this is fascinating to hear about the politics of writing a book."
Yes.
Most people don't have any idea that writing a book can be so political, if I can use that term.
Yeah.
So that's important, I think, for us to keep in mind. I mean, 100 readers, how on earth? Yes, could you please 100 readers?
Crazy.
So when it comes to the what I'll just say, the politics of writing the book, is there anything else to share on that, or is this bring a story to a fairly well-rounded conclusion on that question?
Well, I think in the main, the majority of the readers were happy with the book. As I said, there are, individuals in some other areas of the world that would have liked to have more said about their particular history. But as it is, my personal feeling is when you get to the mission-oriented chapters, where Swartz is dealing with the expansion of our work in other countries, those chapters are kind of listy. That's how I would describe it. Listy, this person did that in this year at that point. Then that person did that at that point in this country. There's not much room for development, for anecdote, for telling stories, for giving some of the human interest side, because you've got to cover too much. They made us cover too much territory. So when Greenleaf revised the book, he left chapters 1 through 18 basically the same, but chapters 19 through 38, he made significant changes, and he tried to develop themes rather than, encyclopedic, listy type of writing. He developed themes, and I think that went much, much better. I know that our African American brethren and sisters were pleased with Swartz's cover of Black history because, as I mentioned earlier, he did teach African American history, so he was somewhat familiar with the background and context, of slavery, of Reconstruction, of Jim Crow segregation, all of that. I think they were happy with how he covered that. I don't know that the Adventist women, I don't think TEAM existed yet, Time for Equality in Adventist Ministry. I don't know that they were in existence in the mid-70s. But if they had been, they probably would have pushed for, let's have more about women in there. I might mention, however, that women's history in America as a field was just beginning in the 70s. There really wasn't a well-developed... I taught in the women's history program at the University of Iowa when I was getting my PhD. And so it was a developing field at the University of Iowa, and you could get a bachelor's degree in it and maybe a master's degree. Eventually they developed a doctor's degree in it. So it was just a developing field. Of course, Swartz had taken his doctoral classes in the 1950s and 60s, so he didn't have that background yet.
Sure. Well, I mean, and even to this day, in the early 2020s, Adventist women's history is very underdeveloped.
Sure.
And so back in the 70s, you didn't have a whole lot to work with.
We didn't. You're right.
I mean, this is, you've just told us today that you are the one who found Sarah Halleck Lindsay.
Right.
You know, and we now know, of course, that she was the first licensed minister, but you didn't find that out until you were doing the research for this book.
That's right.
So, I mean, there's obviously so much more to learn about the role of women in particular. But for the time, he did improve the story quite a bit on that score even, I would say.
Yes.
So do you have any other comments you'd like to make about Greenleaf's revisions of the book? You mentioned that he kind of adjusted the final chapters, but my understanding that the page numbers are about the same, right?
They are.
Between the books. So tell us a little bit more about the revisions if you
Well,
can.
he was given a very challenging task. We want the textbook to be about the same number of pages, but we want you to add 30 years to it, you know.
Yeah, how do you do that?
Yeah, how do you do that? How do you do that? I mean, there's been so much development and so much expansion around the world that it was a real challenge for him. Now, he had it turned out to be 3 years off from teaching at Southern. And indirectly, I assisted him because he asked me to come down to Southern and teach his courses while he was working on the revision. I was wrapping up my doctoral work at the University of Iowa. I had just finished my PhD comprehensive exams, and he called and said, would you come down and teach my classes for 2 or 3 years while I work on the revision? So I did that, and so he had me to consult with from time to time about how Swartz had done things. Now, in another way, he had an easier task because he knew how to type. This was in the 1990s. He may have even had a PC at that time. So he knew how to type and may have typed the original manuscript on his computer. He also had access to, there was an Adventist Heritage Center at Southern at the time. He chose a young fellow, I believe a history major from Southern, to assist him. But basically, he had to only please 3 or 4 readers, he told me. So when he finished a chapter manuscript, you know, he could send it into the education department, the general conference, and 3 or 4 readers would look it over and send him their results fairly quickly. So the second half of the book, from chapters 19 to 38, was a little easier in that sense. He didn't have to please so many people. Interestingly enough, I asked my students, you know, when the revised Light Bearers came out, I said, do you notice any difference between chapters 1 through 18 and chapters 19 through 38? They said, yeah, we do notice a difference. I said, what difference do you notice? Well, there's more stories, more anecdotes, more human interest in the first 18 chapters. And in the last 18, 20 chapters, there's more quantitative stuff. There's more numbers, more statistics, more charts, more graphs. I said, you're right. I said, the first 18 chapters is Swartz. The last 18 to 20 chapters is Greenleaf. And Greenleaf is a quantitative historian. You know, he likes numbers. You know, he's kind of Loughboroughian in that sense. Loughborough, rise and progress, right? So how do you prove that it's rising and progressing? You give numbers. You know, I'm working on the history of the Indiana Conference, as you know, and every time Loughborough shows up for a camp meeting appointment, he always asks the conference leadership, well, how many converts do you have over the last, how many churches have been formed? How's your tithe? And then he always gives his camp meeting report with all these numbers appended to it. So Greenleaf likes numbers. Students, in the main, tend to like Swartz's style. And, you know, they prefer that over Greenleaf's style. But Greenleaf did a good job. He went to the General Conference archives to update some of this. I don't remember Swartz making a trip to the General Conference archives. He may have after I worked for him for a year. But Greenleaf definitely did. He did a lot of work in the GC archives. So 3 years, and he had it done. Now, it took us 5, you know. I started in 74, and the book came out in 79. But like I say, we had a lot more people to please.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Do you know who the 3 readers were for the updated edition?
I don't. I don't. He didn't tell me. And of course, in the revised book, their names are not there either. My name's not in this book either. Swartz wanted it to be in there, but they figured, no, we're going far enough to put Swartz's name on the book. So,
oh,
but,
man.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, it sounds to me like actually both editions are still worth reading, or at least consulting for research purposes. This original first edition has data that's cut out of the first or of the second edition, right? So when I realized that, I made sure that I had both copies in my library.
Yes. I think they make excellent reference books. I don't know that they're being used much today in teaching classes. I know at Southern, for example, they teach Adventist history on the freshman-sophomore level. Mm-hmm. So this is too advanced for them.
Yeah.
This was intended originally for juniors and seniors.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, now we're 20 years out of the last edition, and either a third edition needs to come out or another comprehensive history needs to be written soon, which, to my knowledge, there's not even anything in the works for this.
Well, I know at one point, and this is several years ago, Mike Campbell was talking about working with Judd Lake on something like that.
Was it Judd Lake or Ed Allen?
It could be Ed Allen.
I thought it was Ed.
That might
actually
be the name, yeah.
Yeah.
But Mike had emailed me that he was interested in doing something like this, a shorter book.
Yeah, right.
A shorter book. But then, you know, they've all gone on to their own research projects, and I, like you, I haven't heard anything about its progress.
Yeah.
Since.
So before we ended, I wanted to ask another specific question about your role here, because what drove Schwartz to you specifically? Why were you chosen and selected to work on this project with him?
Well, thank you. It was a surprise to me. Schwartz knew that 7 different academies here in the United States, Adventist academies, had already contacted me about coming to their campus the following year and teaching either history or my minor areas, English and French. So I was trying to decide which academy I should go to. And one of them was my alma mater, Union Springs Academy. And one day in the spring of 1974, he called me into his office and he said, "Brian, I have been asked by the General Conference Education Department to write a textbook on the history of our church." He said, "They've left it entirely up to me what person I choose to be my research assistant. But they will pay your salary." As I recall, it was something like $8,000. If I had gone into teaching the next year, I would have made double that. But $8,000 broke down to about $5 an hour. We worked 40-hour weeks doing this, 8 to 5 Monday through Thursday and 8 to noon on Friday. He said, I'd like you to be my research assistant. And I said, "Why me? You know, there's 7 grad students who are finishing their MA degrees in history this summer. Why me?" "Well," he said, "you took great historians from me and you did an outstanding paper on a 20th century historian. It was detailed, it was analytical, it was perfectly footnoted." He said, I know you understand research style. You understand it. He said, "I have confidence that you would do a quality job on this." I think subsequent to that, I reaffirmed his confidence. When I took my 2-hour oral exam, which was comprehensive that summer, I remember stepping in after they asked me to step out. They made their decision. I stepped in, and Schwartz was there, and they said, We've decided unanimously we're going to give you a high pass." I said, "Nobody gets a high pass." I've been told you never give high passes. In fact, since the MA program began in 1958, and this is 1974, there hadn't been any high pass. Well, but we think you deserve it. We're giving you a high pass, the first one to any grad student here. So I think Swartz felt that, I knew how to read and write and do research and prepare scholarly types of writing, and he had confidence that I would stay on task, on target, because, he wasn't looking over my shoulder all day long. I was basically on my own with the source and the typewriter and taking notes, handing them to him. But I decided, and I'm thankful that I did, I decided, yeah, I'll go with this. I'll go with this. I don't know that much about Adventist history. The last Adventist history course I'd had was an academy. They didn't offer one at Southern at the time. And I'm forever grateful that he gave me the opportunity. We had a wonderful working relationship, he and I, kind of like father and son. As a matter of fact, in those days, for a college student or a graduate student to get a Visa card or a MasterCard, you had to have an adult sign for you. Well, I'm in Michigan, my father's in New York, and Dr. Swartz said, I'll sign for you. I have confidence you'll know how to handle your finances. Only $8,000, there's not a whole lot to work with there. So he signed for my first Visa card. We had kind of a father-son relationship. And during the summer of 77, the book was still ongoing. He and Joyce, his wife, invited me to live with them. And I spent several weeks that summer living with them and going to the office. At that time, Swartz was our academic VP. And he set up a desk outside his office, and I would work on the manuscripts and do the research for him as we wrapped up the project. So I continued, reading manuscripts and doing a little research for him through 1977. I'm eternally grateful to him, because without that opportunity, I would not have made these discoveries in Adventist history. I would not have written the dozens of articles and 6 or 7 books on Adventist history.
Yeah.
Including biographies of J.N. Loughborough that had never been written before.
Byington.
John Byington, yes, and I'm working currently on Hiram Edson. We've got no books on Hiram Edson. So without the opportunity that he provided, I would not have had the background or the interest to continue. So I look back upon that experience with no regrets. Yeah, I only made $8,000, and there was no retirement benefits, no medical, health, dental benefits. But at 23, I didn't need those,
Yep.
So it was a wonderful experience for me, and I'll always be grateful to him for that opportunity that he gave me.
Yeah, it really launched your career, didn't it?
It did.
Yeah.
It definitely did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, to wrap up, I've got to ask. So we learned today about how you became a witch hunter. But we need to put on record, where did you get the nickname Strayer the Slayer?
Ah, yes.
We got to close with that.
All right. At the University of Iowa, where I taught, earning my PhD degree in European history, all classes were essay classes. They were writing classes. And I taught for 2 years in the Women's Studies program, but the classes were limited to 25 students maximum. So when I was called to go down to Southern, I planned to do the same thing. Essay quizzes at the beginning of every class, essay exams, and I discovered down there that I was expected to teach civ classes. One section was 150 students, and another was 100 students, plus 2 upper division classes of 5 to 10 students. But being a Trojan by birth, I soldiered on, and I gave them essay quizzes and essay tests. So I got the reputation for being very, very tough. I don't know what my nickname was down there, but when I came up to Andrews in 1983, and I was doing the same thing, everybody else in the department, all the other professors, colleagues of mine, were giving, matching multiple choice, fill in the blank, true, false quizzes and tests. I was giving essay quizzes essay test. Now the classes were somewhat smaller. Originally, I think they were like 25 or 30. But I think behind the scenes teachers get nicknames, and most of the time they probably never know what they are. But a student let it out one day, who was, probably my reader, I'm guessing, said, you've got a nickname here on campus. I said, really? Really, what is it? She said, you're known as Strayer the Slayer. I said, oh, that kind of rhymes, doesn't it? She says, yeah, because you're the toughest professor in the department with all those essay quizzes and essay exams. And when they write book reviews, you go over them meticulously for parts of speech and punctuation and all that. She says, so they're calling you Strayer the Slayer. I said, well, I think I'm going to adopt that with pride. I think I'm going to wear that mantle with pleasure, because whoever said college was supposed to be easy,
Right.
You're here to learn something. And so, yeah, that was kind of the nickname that lasted, at least until I retired 6 years ago. Probably today's students have never heard it. I still go to the colloquiums. The department is holding colloquiums every Tuesday, and I go to the colloquiums, and they feed the students, and they have presentations. So when I was introduced by the department chair, I subsequently introduced myself as Strayer the Slayer. I said, your older brothers and sisters have probably told you about me, and this is my nickname, or was my nickname here on campus. I said, but now your GPAs are going to rise, because none of you are going to be taking any classes from me. So I didn't take it derogatorily. I wore that mantle with pride, because I saw students start my class with D's and end with A's. By the time I retired, the average grade in my Civ class was B+. B+. When I started teaching in 1983, 25% of my Civ students got Fs.
Wow.
25%. Yeah. So I had to learn some more effective teaching methods to help them learn better. And I began to learn the different types of learners that were out there, Not all learners are like me. I take furious notes because I'm a sight learner. But there were others that were tactile learners, and they'd sit there and they'd knit and crochet or doodle. I have a picture of me that a student actually sketched with pen and ink. One of those that you can get in Paris up on Montmartre, it's kind of a satirical print of yourself. It's really good. I have it framed. And he did that during class. He said, I hope you're not offended. He said, I learn better if my fingers are busy while you're lecturing. I said, no, you're a tactile learner. I understand that. And the next day I came back, I gave him a check for $25. I said, that's what they get up on Montmartre in Paris for a sketch like you gave me. Dropped his jaw. He had no idea it was worth that much. I said, it is to me. I'm going to frame it. So once I learned what different learners, how they learn and so forth, and then I could adapt my teaching style. And they use the Writing Center, send them to the Writing Center to get extra help with those essays that I require them to. They're only 2 pages long, and they got better and better and better. And like I say, by the time I retired in the 21st century, the average Civ grade, this is all students' grades, we're talking 40, 50 students, was a B+. Yeah.
Wow.
So I learned, they learned, we all progressed together. I still had the same nickname, but my students were doing a whole lot better.
Yeah, well, by the time I heard it from my wife, it was definitely sort of like a compliment kind of thing.
I see.
So,
Okay.
But of course, my wife is academically inclined.
Yes.
She loves writing, and that's
Oh,
her gift.
good.
So that was never an issue for her.
Wonderful. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yep.
No, the kind of gratitude that I appreciate most is what I call the 10-year gratitude. Students who graduate, go on, get married, start their careers and so forth, and they come back for an alumni reunion and say, I remember you. I took such and such a class from you. And you said such and such in this class, and it always stuck with me. I had one, I was working at the Berrien County Historical Association booth at the fair last month in August. I had a student drop by that booth from Africa. And she remembered taking honors civ from me and what she had learned. It was oriented toward women's history that year. And there was another student that dropped by my booth, and he went back 40 years. And he said, I remember your lecture on Alexander the Great, how you recited a poem comparing Alexander the Great and Jesus Christ, who died the same age, okay, at 33. And you compared their careers and how one brought hope and salvation and the other brought death and destruction. And it wasn't my poem, it was somebody else's poem I was reciting, but he was remembering that from 40 years ago. Others will come back and say, you know, I remember all that past is always present stuff you put up on the board. That's what I write about my column, you know, in the journal Era every week. That past is always present. He said, that stuck with me because it related to my present, related to my history right now, brought the past into my present. So those are the kind of compliments that I appreciate most. I call it the 10-year, 20-year, 30-year gratitude, you know.
Wow. Well, thank you so much
You're
for your time today and helping to enrich our understanding of the history, the history of Light Bearers to the Remnant, which was a monumental text for the church, and for your own, to where we can understand a little bit more about Strayer the Slayer, the infamous witch hunter.
There you go. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Been fun.